Live television had seen awkward debates before, but no one was prepared for what Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett dropped that night. With a calm voice and a folder full of buried records, she exposed secrets Melania Trump spent years trying to erase, and when the cameras kept rolling, so did the fallout. Before we dive in, make sure to subscribe for deep dive stories that go beyond headlines and into the real power struggles shaping our world. More exposes are coming, and you do not want to miss what is next. The lights inside the studio were soft but sharp, the kind that made everything look more expensive than it really was. Blue panels glowed behind the guests, clean and cool. The chairs were tall, the mugs untouched. Everything looked like control. Nothing looked like risk. Jasmine Crockett sat third from the left. She wore a navy blazer that fit just right. Her hands rested on a closed folder in her lap. She said little, took a few notes, watched more than she spoke. Her expression was quiet, focused, the kind of calm that did not come from comfort but from preparation. Across the table sat Melania Trump. Perfect hair, flawless posture, her smile polite but distant. She looked like she always had in interviews. Beautiful, polished, just out of reach. She nodded when she needed to, gave short answers, smiled when the camera found her. Everyone in the room had seen this before. The host was in the middle. He guided the conversation with the same rhythm he had used for years. A question here, a prompt there. Nothing too sharp. Everyone knew their role. The audience at home expected nothing different. For guests, one moderator, a few talking points, and maybe a clever line or two to clip later for social media. That was the plan, but something started to shift. It was small at first, a slight change in the air when the word ethics came up. The panel moved into the topic like it was just another checkpoint, but Jasmine leaned in just a little, not enough to draw attention, just enough to show she was listening in a new way. Melania answered a question about integrity. Her words were smooth, measured, familiar. It sounded like something she had said before. The audience kept watching, relaxed, waiting for the next segment. But Jasmine was no longer just watching. She tapped the edge of her folder once with her finger, a small move, easy to miss. But behind her stillness was something different. Not anger, not nerves. Something more exact. The kind of stillness that comes when someone knows exactly what they are about to say. When Jasmine finally spoke, her voice was low but clear. She did not raise it. She did not rush. But what she said was sharp enough to freeze the room. It was not just a comment. It was a line-drawn dot. She said the words without blinking. The kind of sentence that makes people turn their heads. The kind that makes a host forget what was next on the cue card. This was not part of the script. This was not what anyone was ready for. And before she even opened that folder, the conversation had already changed. Because what Jasmine Crockett was about to do was not a moment. It was a match. And everyone watching would soon see what happens when someone decides to light it. The moderator had just asked a standard question about ethics and government, the kind guests usually answer with talking points. Melania Trump leaned forward and smiled. She gave the kind of polished answer you expect from someone used to cameras. The words sounded right, safe, like they had been rehearsed before. Then Jasmine Crockett leaned in. Not a big move, just a few inches, but it was enough. Enough to shift the mood in the studio, enough to make the room feel tighter. Her voice was calm, but there was something in her tone, something focused, something heavy. She said, if we are talking about ethics, then let us stop pretending that some people get a free pass just because of who they married. The panel went silent. The host blinked. He glanced at the teleprompter, then at the producers behind the glass. Melania paused. Her expression stayed controlled, but her eyes moved. She tilted her head just slightly. Excuse me, she said. Was that directed at me? Jasmine did not flinch. She reached into her bag. No rush, no big performance, just a smooth, deliberate motion. She pulled out a folder and placed it on the table. Then she opened it. She slid the clip off and started laying out documents. One, then another, then another. These are transaction logs, offshore account filings, a report from a case that was closed before anyone followed up. The air in the studio changed. All of them are tied to shell companies that operated in the early 2000s, and every single one is connected to your name. Melania looked down at the papers. She opened her mouth, then closed it. She glanced at the host, then said, "This is ridiculous. I will not engage in conspiracy theories." Jasmine replied, steady and calm. "It is not a theory if the evidence comes from court filings and bank records." Behind the scenes, people started moving. A producer waved from the control booth. An assistant handed a note to the moderator. But no one said a word on camera. No one wanted to cut away because something real was happening. Melania tried again. "We are here to talk about America's future, not to bring up old nonsense from foreign countries." Jasmine kept her eyes on her. Her voice never rose. "With all due respect, when your past raises questions about influence and money laundering, then it is very much about America's future." The host finally found his voice. "Let us stay on topic, please." I am on topic, Jasmine said. The topic is accountability. People watching at home sat still. Phones buzzed, screens lit up, clips were already being trimmed and shared in real time. On Twitter, a new hashtag started trending. Hashtag Jasmine has receipts, then another. Crockett vs Melania. In the control room, producers whispered into headsets. Some wanted to cut to commercial. Others said, keep it going. The engagement was through the roof. Melania sat upright, her hands tight on the arms of her chair. Her voice lost some of its charm. You are only attacking me because you have no policy. You are not talking about health, care, or the economy. You are obsessed with tearing down women who succeed. Jasmine responded without hesitation. If success comes from silence and manipulation, then it is not success. I am not here to tear anyone down. I am here because too many people have been told to look the other way. At that point, one of the other panelists leaned over to his neighbor and whispered, this is going to blow up. They were right. And it already had. If this kind of fearless truth matters to you, hit that subscribe button. Support independent stories that challenge power because silence protects privilege, and we are here to challenge that. 3 days before everything unfolded on live television, Jasmine Crockett sat in a booth at a small diner just outside Fort Worth. The place was quiet, tucked off the highway. The kind of place where the waitress refilled your coffee before you could ask, and called everyone hun. Jasmine had a folder on the table in front of her. It was not the same one she would carry into the studio, but it was close. Across from her sat Kenny Rowe, her chief of staff. He had been with her through tough campaigns and long nights. He leaned in, his voice low. This is not just political, he said. This is Melania Trump. If you go forward with this, they are going to come after you hard. Jasmine stirred her coffee but did not drink it. Her eyes were fixed on the folder. Let them, she said quietly. People need to stop acting like she was just some bystander. There is paperwork, Kenny. There is proof. He glanced toward the window and let out a slow breath. Proof does not always win. Sometimes it just buries you. Jasmine said nothing. She had spent most of her life walking into rooms where she was not expected to speak, let alone lead. A black woman from the south side of Dallas. No family connections, no old money, just determination and receipts. She had clawed her way through law school, spent years defending people the system had written off. When she ran for Congress, she ran without big donors or party machines. She won with volunteers and late-night text banks. And when she got to Washington, they smiled in front of her. But behind closed doors, they feared how direct she was when she spoke. I am not trying to start a fire, she said finally. I am just trying to show people it is already burning. That night, back in her apartment, she laid out the documents again. Pages from an old fraud investigation in Syracuse, the one no one ever followed up on. The signatures looked messy, names were misspelled, dates did not line up. Then came the financial statements. Wire transfers to offshore accounts in the British Virgin Islands. All dated just before Donald Trump began his presidential run. She did not have the full picture, but she had enough of the corners to see what had been hidden. It was not just the risk of lawsuits or media blowback. This was personal. She was not just calling out a former first lady. She was challenging the machine that had kept powerful people safe for decades. Her phone buzzed. A message from a friend who worked at an independent news outlet in Pittsburgh. Are you really going through with this? They are going to twist it. Say you are unstable, angry. Jasmine looked at the message, then typed back, they always say that. Until they cannot. The next morning, she called someone she had not spoken to in years. Dolores Finney, a retired federal clerk who had passed her the Syracuse documents a long time ago. Dolores answered, with a raspy voice, calm and slow. You sure you are ready to go public with this? She asked. They buried too much, Jasmine replied. You and I both know her past did not just disappear. Someone made sure it was erased. Dolores was quiet for a second, then she chuckled. You have got bigger guts than half the people I worked with at the DOJ. Jasmine smiled, but the weight stayed on her chest. Courage always came with a price. And the clock was always ticking. By the time she walked into that studio 3 days later, the folder felt heavier than it should have, not because of the paper, because of what it meant. There would not be a second chance. She had to be clear the first time, or the moment would slip through the cracks. 10 minutes before airtime, she looked in the hallway mirror. She reminded herself of the rules. Be calm, be sharp. Let the facts do the shouting. Then, just like she always did before, something big. She whispered 3 words. Tell the truth. Jasmine Crockett did not jump in blindly. She had learned early in her legal career that truth on its own was not enough. You needed proof. You needed patterns. You needed to make it impossible for people to look away. So when she decided to investigate Melania Trump, she did not start with headlines. She started with silence. All the things that had never been said out loud. It began with a question from one of her interns, a young man named Troy Whitman, 24 years old, sharp, restless, always digging through old public records. He found a patent application signed by Melania in Zurich back in 1998. The issue was not the patent itself, it was the timeline. According to past interviews, Melania said she had moved to the United States full-time by then. The paperwork said, otherwise. Troy brought the file to Jasmine late one evening. He laid it on her desk and said, she claimed to be in New York, but this document proves she was still conducting business in Europe. Jasmine leaned in. The signature was clean. The date was clear. It was not just an oversight. It was a lie wrapped in technical details. As they kept digging, more names started to surface. Meskinos Holdings, a real estate shell company based out of Pennsylvania. A boutique firm registered in New Mexico under a cousin's name. A short-lived consulting agency in Miami with no staff and one massive loan. None of it had ever been disclosed during Donald Trump's campaign. Jasmine pulled old press clips, combed through asset filings, matched bank statements to public appearances. The deeper she looked, the more the gaps started to line up. Nothing big enough to stand out on its own, but together, they formed a pattern. One that looked intentional. Then came the IRS connection. Years earlier, Jasmine had been given access to a folder by a retired federal clerk named Dolores. Inside was a copy of a memo tied to a case that had gone cold. It named a Slovenian accountant who had been cooperating with the IRS. Her name was Lydia Corky. She had been living in Buffalo under a temporary visa. According to the memo, Lydia had flagged suspicious transfers linked to small real estate flips and overseas accounts. But then she vanished. No flights, no border records, no contact with her assigned agents. One day she was helping build a case. The next she was gone. The memo was marked inactive and later closed due to lack of testimony. Jasmine stared at Lydia's name for a long time. It stayed with her. She pinned it on her board with a red pushpin, right next to the shell company maps and wire receipts. She was not sure what happened to Lydia, but she had a feeling it was no accident. She started laying everything out in her office. Maps, names, arrows, pages with offshore company records. Property transfers that never made the news. Statements from banks that operated just outside regulation. Jasmine was not guessing. She was building. What struck her most was how quiet it all was. There were no dramatic headlines, no courtroom drama, just a slow, careful structure that hid everything in plain sight. Melania had spent years building an image that looked untouched, but behind that image were stacks of paper that told a different story. Jasmine worked in silence, night after night. She printed every page, cross-referenced every line. It was not glamorous, it was not loud, but it was exact. She knew she would only have one chance to show it, so it had to be perfect. By the time she was finished, her wall was full, not with theories, with facts, and all of them pointed to one truth. Someone had worked very hard to make sure the public never asked the right questions. Jasmine was ready to ask them anyway. The moment Jasmine closed the folder on live TV, everything behind the scenes went into motion. Inside the control room, producers were signaling, talking over each other, trying to decide whether to cut to commercial or keep rolling. The host sat frozen, caught between the teleprompter and the silence. Melania Trump kept her eyes steady, but her team was already moving. Her assistant typed furiously on a phone. A staffer disappeared off-set before the segment even ended. By the time Jasmine stepped off stage, the messages had already started. Her phone buzzed nonstop. Some were from supporters, others were not. One message was a photo, a still frame of her walking to her car the night before. It had been taken from a distance. No message, just the image. Another message read, "Keep pushing and you will disappear, too." Jasmine looked at it once, then deleted it. Kenny wanted to call the police. She said, "Not yet." By that night, the spin machine had already kicked into gear. Fox News ran a segment calling her out for character assassination. One anchor described her as an angry black woman with a grudge. A former campaign advisor went on air claiming the documents were staged. The word forgery showed up in more than one headline. None of them showed the documents. None of them fact-checked anything. But not everyone bought the spin. On social media, clips from the broadcast spread fast. Hashtags like hashtag Jasmine has receipts and hashtag Crockett vs Melania began trending within the hour. A journalist from the Indianapolis Ledger named Farah Odom posted a breakdown of Jasmine's evidence. She lined it up with verified court records and banking data. In less than 3 hours, her post had hundreds of thousands of views. Farah's final line read, "If even half of this is real, it deserves congressional attention." That was when the tone began to shift. Some people still called it political theater. Others started asking real questions. Talk shows debated it. Fact-checkers took screenshots from the broadcast and compared them to old filings. It was not just a viral moment anymore. It was a story that refused to disappear. Then came the file. Just after midnight, Jasmine received an email with no name and no signature. The subject line read, "You missed the Cayman transfer." Attached was a PDF. 3 wire transfers from a shell account she had flagged earlier. The numbers matched. The dates lined up. The money trail extended farther than she had realized. Kenny stared at the file. Where did this come from? I do not know, Jasmine said. But it is real. They sat in silence for a moment, both staring at the screen. Then she added the new documents to her wall. Another connection. Another piece they had tried to keep buried. Outside, the backlash kept building. Right-wing commentators doubled down. One accused her of staging the confrontation for social media fame. Another said she was trying to build a political brand on Melania's name. Jasmine ignored it. She had expected all of it. What she had not expected was how many people were ready to speak up. Emails came in from former staffers, accountants, assistants. Some just wanted to say thank you. Others sent tips. People who had stayed quiet for years now felt like someone was finally listening. Jasmine read every message. She took notes on the ones that mattered. She started handing off names to her legal team. This was not just damage control anymore, it was defense. The machine was not just reacting, it was trying to erase her, but it was too late for that. The story was already out. The footage was already everywhere. The documents had been seen, clipped, archived, and shared by millions. And Jasmine was not going quiet. Not now. Not with more proof in her hands. Not when people were finally paying attention. Jasmine Crockett had known this would stir something, but she did not expect the wave that came next. It started with a few direct messages. Quiet, careful words from people who had been silent for years. A retired bookkeeper from Wilmington. A former intern from a New York nonprofit. A man who once worked at an overseas tax firm. They all said the same thing in different ways. You were right to speak up, and I have something you should see. Her inbox filled up fast. Too fast for her small team to keep up. Kenny brought in 2 extra aides just to sort through the flood of encrypted emails. Most were anonymous. Some had names, dates, documents, wire receipts, old HR forms, copies of contracts that had never been made public. Not all of it was solid, but the pattern was clear. People who had stayed quiet were finally ready to talk. Jasmine sat at her desk and scrolled through message after message. One came from a woman who claimed to have worked as an assistant on one of Melania's early business projects. She wrote that the contracts were always cash only. No digital trail. Everything handled by a cousin who never gave out a last name. Jasmine forwarded the message to her legal advisor and flagged it. If even part of that was true, it filled another gap in the timeline. Then came the amplification. Celebrities started posting the broadcast clip. An actress with millions of followers wrote, "This is how you call out power.com, sharp, with facts." A former NBA player shared the video and added, "We need more women like her in politics." News anchors who had brushed off the story earlier were now talking about it on air. They showed the documents. They replayed the exchange. They admitted this was not just a viral clip. It was a moment with weight. Community groups picked it up next. A book club in Ohio used the segment to open a real discussion about financial transparency. A church group in Georgia passed the video around during a weekend retreat. A radio host in Cincinnati dedicated an entire morning show to unpacking Jasmine's timeline. It was not just on national media anymore. It was in kitchens, in carpools and coffee shops. Jasmine was not trying to go viral. She had said what she said because someone needed to. But now the story was living on its own. Kenny looked up from his phone one afternoon and said, "This clip just hit 10 million views." Jasmine nodded, but her eyes stayed on the folder. In her lap, there was still more to sort through. That was when the messages changed. Not just supporters now. People from Melania's world started reaching out. Some subtle, some direct. One former stylist sent a voice memo. She said, "There was always someone handling things in the background, someone making sure her name stayed off the paperwork." Another email came from a person who claimed to have worked briefly for a branding firm, tied to Melania's early days in Miami. They said their records were wiped after the company was bought out, but they remembered cash payments. No contracts, no receipts. Jasmine sent that message to the cyber team to trace the metadata. She did not know if all of it would hold up in court, but she knew what she was seeing. People were no longer afraid to talk. What had started with one folder and one voice had become a chorus. And for the first time in a long time, it felt like the silence was cracking. 19 days after the live TV broadcast, Jasmine Crockett walked into a room no one could ignore. The hearing had been called under public pressure. Too many questions, too much evidence, too much silence. The House Subcommittee on Government Oversight opened a formal review. What had started as a 7-minute exchange on television was now official business in the halls of Congress. The hearing room was plain, beige walls, wooden desks, outdated microphones that echoed too easily, but the cameras were everywhere. Networks had sent full teams. Reporters sat shoulder to shoulder. Viewers tuned in from offices, airports, classrooms. Number one was just curious anymore. People wanted answers. Jasmine entered with a calm that came from doing the work. No flashy colors, no dramatic opening line, just a simple, dark blazer and a folder she had been carrying for weeks. She took her seat, adjusted the microphone, and waited. Representative Harold Klein, who chaired the committee, cleared his throat. "This is not a trial," he said. "This is not a political spectacle. This is a step toward clarity." Then he looked at her and said, "Congresswoman Crockett, the floor is yours." Jasmine did not thank him. She did not make a speech. She opened her folder and spoke in a steady voice. "Everything I presented came from public and legal records, court filings, banking statements, corporate paperwork. This is not personal. This is not performance. This is about patterns. And those patterns suggest misuse of power, trust, and silence." Then she paused. If anyone else had been tied to these documents, anyone without that last name, this hearing would have happened. Years ago, the room shifted. Klein looked down at his notes. One of the junior representatives leaned over to whisper something but stayed quiet. A screen lit up behind Jasmine. One of the wire transfers she had shown on live television appeared in full, a highlighted account number, a name, a date. She walked the committee through it line by line. From the offshore company in Delaware to the matching account in Slovenia, every number backed up with a real document. Nothing hidden, no guesswork. Then came the moment no one planned. From the gallery, a man stood up. He handed an envelope to the sergeant at arms. It was not scheduled. It was not part of the hearing. Inside were copies of 6 invoices tied to a charity fund. Melania Trump had once supported publicly in Florida. All of them showed large payments. None of them reached the organizations listed as beneficiaries. The committee froze. The documents were passed to Jasmine. She flipped through the pages. Her expression did not change. Then she looked up and said, "This is what happens when people see the door open. They come forward." Melania Trump was not there. Her legal team had submitted a short statement. Mrs. Trump has nothing to hide. She will not dignify political bullying with her presence. But the cameras had already found the empty seat next to Jasmine. The image of that vacant chair said more than the statement ever could. As the hearing continued, media outlets began to shift their tone. Anchors who once called it a distraction were now showing full charts and timelines. Commentators debated the evidence, not the optics. Fact-checkers updated their reports. The public was not just watching anymore. They were taking notes. Kenny stood off to the side, arms crossed. He had seen Jasmine take on hard rooms before, but this was different. This was national. This was live. He whispered to a staffer. "I thought we were just shaking a tree. We started a landslide." Outside, people gathered. Some held signs, some shouted, some just stood in silence. But inside, Jasmine stayed focused. She answered every question with a document, every doubt with a receipt. No drama, just facts. When the hearing closed, Representative Klein said they would reconvene after reviewing the new materials. He did not try to soften the moment. He just said, "Let the record show, this is far from over." Jasmine nodded once, gathered her papers, and left the room. She did not speak to the cameras. She did not need to, because the country had just watched her speak where it mattered, and this time, they were listening. After the hearing, things changed quickly for Jasmine Crockett. Not just in the news, but in the halls of Congress. The same people who used to nod at her in meetings now looked away. Conversations ended when she walked into a room. Staffers who had once been friendly now kept their distance. Even people who agreed with her were too nervous to be seen talking for too long. The pressure came from every direction. Donors started pulling out of fundraisers. Scheduled calls were suddenly postponed. One longtime supporter sent a message saying, "We love what you stand for, but the timing is difficult." Her campaign team tried to spin it as politics as usual, but Jasmine knew better. This was the cost of making powerful people uncomfortable. Inside the Capitol, it got colder, not in temperature, but in tone. Leadership stopped being polite. A senior colleague pulled her aside outside a committee room and said, "We get it, Jasmine, but maybe let it rest. Let the public move on." She said nothing at first, just listened. Then she looked him in the eye and said, "Truth has fingerprints, and people are starting to see them." That was the end of the conversation. Later that day, Kenny found her in her office, sorting documents. He had a message in his hand. A lobbyist had offered support for her next election if she softened her stance. Maybe revise her public statements. Maybe call the hearing a necessary but unfortunate moment. Jasmine barely glanced at the message, then she threw it in the bin. She knew what they wanted. They did not want her quiet. They wanted her neutral, calm, smiling, and easy to ignore. But she was not going to give them that. Then came the envelope. No return address, just delivered by courier with her name on the front. Inside was a printed still from a security camera. A blurry image of Jasmine, walking through Reagan Airport, her face circled in red ink. No note, no context, just that image. Kenny saw it and froze. "We need to report this," he said. Jasmine stared at it for a while. She was not afraid, not really, but the message was clear. Someone was watching. Someone wanted her to feel exposed. She taped the photo above her desk. just above her wall of documents, not to scare herself but to stay focused, to remember what kind of power she was dealing with. "This is what it looks like," she said softly, "when truth starts making people nervous." She went back to work. No press conferences, no tweets, just the same files, the same notes, and the same mission. Because Jasmine Crockett had never been in it for attention. She had been in it to break the silence. And silence was starting to crack. The ripple did not stop with the hearing. It started showing up in places Jasmine never expected. Classrooms began using clips from her testimony as teaching tools. Students paused the video at key moments, analyzing the language, the evidence, and the silence in the room. One teacher in Oregon emailed her office and said, "My seniors have never cared about financial transparency before. Now they are asking questions no one has ever brought up." Advocacy groups took notice too. Organizations that had spent years pushing for stronger disclosure laws suddenly had a new example. Jasmine's approach became a model. Clear.com/documented. No shouting, just facts that could not be ignored. A nonprofit in Chicago launched a campaign called Receipts Matter, using her timeline as a blueprint for how local officials should report foreign partnerships. Then came the shift inside Congress. Lawmakers who had stayed quiet during the hearing began requesting briefings. Some asked to see the evidence firsthand. A few even said the words Jasmine had been waiting to hear. "We need to take a second look at our own financial reporting rules." It was small, but it was movement. Not because they suddenly cared, but because they knew the public was watching. Her staff kept a running list on a whiteboard. States that introduced new legislation, agencies that reopened old audits, editors who walked back their early dismissals of her claims. The wall was filling up, one update at a time, but it was the letter that stayed with her the most. It arrived quietly. No return name, just a handwritten envelope postmarked from Iowa. Inside was a note written in neat, steady handwriting. It read, "I used to believe the system could not be challenged, that people like me did not matter. But watching you stand up, with facts in your hand and fire in your voice, made me believe again. Thank you for making me feel seen." Jasmine sat with that letter for a long time. She did not post it online. She did not quote it in a speech. She folded it carefully and placed it in the drawer beside her desk, because she knew what it meant. It was not about going viral. It was not about headlines or It was about the quiet reminder that truth still had weight. And sometimes, the most powerful thing a person can do is speak up, even when they are told to stay silent. 2 weeks after the hearing, Jasmine Crockett stood alone on the small balcony. Outside her district office in Arlington, Texas, the sky was soft with evening light and the air smelled like cut grass. Her phone was still full. Reporters still called. Committees still requested documents. But for the first time in a month, everything around her felt quiet. Inside, Kenny was sorting new messages. 2 more subpoenas had gone out that morning. Another committee had just announced a review of one of the Florida charity funds. The work was not slowing down. If anything, it was picking up speed. But Jasmine stood still for a moment and let it all settle. She thought about everything that had happened, the pressure, the threats, the silence from colleagues who used to smile in the halls, the donors who walked away, the photo from the airport. All of it, every piece came with a cost, but she did not regret it. Because this had never been about bringing down Melania Trump. It had never been about a headline or a single moment on live television. Jasmine knew that power does not just show up in one person. It builds over time. It hides behind smiles and handshakes. It counts on silence to do its work. What she wanted was to break the illusion. The idea that silence equals dignity. That staying quiet makes you respectable. She wanted people to see that silence can be a shield. That it can protect things no one ever questions. And once you start asking those questions, everything shifts. She thought back to the first time she opened that folder. The first signature, the first wire transfer that did not make sense. None of it had come with a headline. It was just paper, facts, receipts. But facts have weight. And when you carry them into a room, that counts. They land hard. Jasmine knew she would never get back the things she had lost. But she had gained something else. A voice that reached beyond Washington. A story that reminded people what truth looks like when it refuses to sit down. So if this story moved you, share it. Talk about it. Ask the questions that others avoid. Because the moment we stop asking questions is the moment we give away our power. And if you believe the truth still matters, subscribe. More stories are coming. And the silence is not going to hold much longer.